Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaea Viking. Today is the official 18th video and the unofficial 12th video of my series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. The subjects of today's video are the hegemons of the South Central Great Plains, the Osage Nation. So, right off the bat, I'm sure those of us in the United States are very familiar, as well as in Canada, are very familiar with the phrase the Great Plains, which is a geographic region in North America reaching as far north as the interior of Canada and as far south as Texas. Then it encompasses states including Oklahoma, Nebraska, um, parts of Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming, as well as Montana and North Dakota, among other states. Now, obviously, the Great Plains have been here for thousands or, hundreds of thousands of years. However, the geographic borders of the states within the Great Plains have not always looked like this. Now, of course, whenever us in our modern world hear the phrase the Great Plains, we, especially those of us in Canada and the United States, we tend to think of the states within the Great Plains, like like Wyoming and Montana and Texas and such. And of course, that's not an incorrect view to have. After all, these states have had their borders for around 100 years or a little more, maybe 140 years, depending on the state. So it's understandable for those of us in the modern world to think to have that view in our minds. However, as I said, it's not the full picture. These states only took their shapes within the Great Plains after a series of events, conflicts, and catalysts. So, in order to get a better look at the bigger picture, we need to go back just a little bit further in time. Starting with the ancient origins of the ancestors of the Osage in the Ohio River Basin. And this is the Ohio River Basin here. So the ancestors of the Osage really get the earliest archaeological evidence of their rise as a people and a culture um, within the Clovis culture from around 11,000 to 10,000 BCE, so around 13,000 to 12,000 years ago. So with that out of the way, uh, the Clovis culture was a culture that existed in what we call the late glacial maximum of North America. You would know it as the late Ice Age. However, that is a little bit of a misnomer because technically we are in an Ice Age in our modern day. Ice Ages can last for hundreds of thousands of years. What they were what the Clovis people were living in was what we call the late glacial maximum, which is the greatest extent of the glaciers in the northern hemisphere. And they were a largely nomadic people who would travel through the North America during the late glacial maximum, or at the very least, they were a semi-nomadic people. And they get their name from the very distinct type of projectile points that were found in the archaeological record that were the first evidence that archaeologists found of them. Um, and as I said, they were very distinct because they have this sort of leaf shape, and every single one of them has this singular, or sometimes two flutes right here in the side of the shaft of the projectile point. And here are some more examples of Clovis points here. And as you can see by this map, the Clovis peoples had a very wide range across North America. As you can see here, here, and here. And this is a map of all the sites associated with the Clovis people. With, of course, several sites, Clovis sites, being found in the Ohio River Basin. And here's another map of all of the Clovis sites in the Northeast Ohio. And then the ancestors of the Osage would transition into the Folsom culture around 10,800 to 10,200 BCE, or right around 12,000 years ago. And this period saw the dying off of the megafauna, the mammoths and such, that the Clovis people hunted. You know, mammoths, mastodon, giant ground sloths, etc., began to die off somewhere towards the tail end of uh, around 11,000 or so years ago. Um, around 12,000 or so years ago, uh, which would lead the ancestors of the Osage, the Clovis culture, to begin adapting their projectile points to hunt smaller game. Smaller, of course, is a little bit of a misnomer in itself because a lot of the smaller game was still rather large, such as bisons, but nonetheless smaller game than mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths. And here's another example of that. And these are actually, for some clarification, these are actually prehistoric steppe bison that were actually quite larger than even the modern bison that we know from the Great Plains of the Old West in the 1800s. And we can tell that they hunted these animals, one, by a lot of kill sites, like bison jumps, if you will, where they would essentially force herds of bison to go over cliffs. But also, we can tell that by their cave art and their petroglyphs, such as this petroglyph of a man. Sorry, not of a mammoth, of a bison here. And their points as I said, were adapted for these much smaller game like bison. Um, but they were still, in a lot of ways, like Clovis points. For example, they still had the sort of Clovis shape, as you can see here, uh, but they were much thinner. Again, these were specifically designed for smaller game. After all, you don't need as big of a shaft for, a deer or a bison. You need the big shaft, the big thick projectile point like a Clovis point for, say, a mammoth or a ground sloth. Not so much for a bison, and that's why the Folsom points look as thin as they did, or became as thin as they did. And here are some more examples here. And as you can see, there is some degree of variation. As some, like I said, do look like Clovis points, but others begin to start looking more like, you know, atlatl dart points, or, eventually arrowhead points, albeit arrowhead points were far smaller than this. And here's some more examples right here. And as you can see, based off of this map, the Folsom culture had a very wide distribution along the Ohio River Valley, as well as, say, the Mississippi and Missouri River areas as well. And here's another map showing that here. And then the ancestors of the Osage would transition into the Archaic period somewhere around 8,000 to 500 BCE. And this was a period that was characterized with the beginning of, if not permanent settlements, at least semi-permanent settlements, meaning that the ancestors of the Osage were beginning to stay in one place for longer. Now they were still hunter-gatherers during this period of time, meaning that they primarily consisted that their food economy primarily consisted of hunting deers and bison and such, as well as harvesting fish, uh, and of course harvesting wild plants like, say, hickory nuts and blackberries. And here's another example of that here. And there's an individual harvesting fish with a basket there. And here's some more examples of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that they would have lived in during this time, again, while beginning to become much more sedentary. And here's examples of some of the projectile points that were used by the ancestors of the Osage during the Archaic period. As you can see, they're beginning to become much smaller than the Folsom and Clovis points, as they were beginning to hunt smaller and smaller game like deer and rabbits and turkeys and things like that. Also, during the Archaic period, the ancestors of the Osage, among other Native American peoples, first began to adopt pottery, as evidenced by these archaeological finds here. Then the ancestors of the Osage would become part of the Adena culture between 500 BCE and 100 CE, as well as the part of the Hopewell culture between 200 BCE and 500 CE. With the Adena being, as the dates imply, much earlier and located around here. Also seen on this map here, with the Adena being associated with mound structures, earthen mound structures, such as the Serpent Mound that you see here. Meanwhile, the Hopewell culture had a much wider cultural range, going as far south as Georgia and Florida and the Gulf Coast, and as far west as the Great Plains. And being associated with large scale trading and interaction networks, an interaction sphere, where Hopewell individuals would collect exotic goods such as obsidian from as far west as Yellowstone and Wyoming, marine shells as far south as the Gulf Coast, and copper as far north as the Great Lakes. And they, too, much like the Adena, were associated with earthen mound structures like you see here. And then, not surprisingly, the ancestors of the Osage would also eventually become part of the Mississippian Fort Ancient culture between 1000 and 1750 CE. And the Fort Ancient culture was a subset culture of the Mississippian culture that was located specifically in the Ohio area, as you can see here, and near the Great Lakes. And this is what the Fort Ancient Mississippian villages would have looked like. And again, like the Adena and the Hopewell, the Fort Ancient culture was associated with earthen mound-like structures, including, again, much like the Adena culture, the Serpent Mound. Now that brings us to the rise of the Osage Nation itself. So, the Osage people, or the ancestors of the Osage people, would separate from, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, from the Dahigian speaking ancestors of the ancestors of the Osage, and would begin to gradually migrate from the Ohio River Valley to the Mississippi and Missouri rivers by 1200 CE at the earliest, but most likely somewhere closer to the mid 1600s at the latest. And you can see that in this map here. After this, upon reaching the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, sometime around the 1500s, 1600s CE, the Osage would begin to expand into the North American Great Plains. And this would not be like in like an explosive expansion, like would not be a singular event. It would be relatively gradual, as you can see based off of this map. First, moving from their original migration area in 1500, eventually to this area by 1541 CE, and then by this area by 1750 CE, and then eventually by 1800 all the way, 1800 CE all the way over here. And here's another map showing the extent of the Osage Nation. During this expansion, as well as this migration to the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, the Osage would begin to war with other powerful Native American nations, such as the Pawnee, Wichita, the Quapaw, and the Kiowa, while also exerting their influence over less powerful Native American nations, such as the Caddo, the Kansa, and the Missouri. And you can see those Native American nations that I mentioned in these maps here. Now, this brings us to their first contacts with Europeans. Starting with the reintroduction of horses into North America and the Great Plains. So, horses would first be reintroduced into North America, and by reintroduced, I mean horses had been in America during the late glacial maximum, but had died somewhere around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, i.e., gone extinct around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. But upon European colonization, specifically Spanish colonization, into the American Southeast, horses would eventually be let loose or escape from Spanish horse pens and Spanish colonies, and would eventually spread throughout the Great Plains, starting in 1600 CE, eventually spreading throughout the Great Plains in 1700 CE. And you can see that in this graph here. Then, after the reintroduction of the horse to the Great Plains, which was the first indirect contact between the Osage and European nations, the first direct contact between the Osage and European nations would come when French explorers Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet would bring the Osage Nation into contact with the French Empire in 1673 CE. And then after this, the earliest clear documentation that the Osage domesticated horses was from French documents in 1690 CE, meaning they domesticated the horse at least by 1690 CE, though one could probably argue a very, very strong case that they possibly domesticated horses before this date. Then, in 1723 CE, the French Empire would found Fort Orleans on the Missouri River. Afterwards, the Osage Nation and other Native American nations would become major participants in the deerskin trade, with the Osage specifically participating sometime between the early 1720s to the early 1800s CE. Then, between the 1720s and 1769 CE, the Osage Nation and other Native American nations would also become major participants in the Native American slave trade, often participating in raids on rival Native American nations, such as the Caddo, to sail into French Louisiana. Now, I have talked about the Native American slave trade in uh, all of the previous videos, and you'll note that these are much later dates than I mentioned in the previous videos. That's because the French Native American slave trade lasted a little bit longer than the British Native American slave trade. In 1725 CE, French officials would lead a delegation of Osage and other Native American leaders to Paris, where they would be shown around France, including a visit to the palace at Versailles, as well as participating in a hunt with Louis XV in the royal forest, and they also got to see an opera. And here are portraits of the various Osage leaders who participated here. In the 1750s CE, the longtime enemies of the Osage Nation, the Wichita Nation, would ally itself with the powerful Comanche Nation. And then the Wichita-Comanche Alliance would begin to sporadically raid and war with the Osage Nation between 1750 and 1754 CE. And here in this picture, here is actually of a Comanche warrior chasing an Osage warrior. Then, eventually, the French Empire would go to war with the British Empire, among other powerful nations and empires, as seen on this map, in the 7 Years' War. And with the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, the Osage Nation would side with the French Empire against the British Empire, participating in the Battle of Fort Duquesne in 1758 CE and the Battle of Fort Niagara in 1759 CE. After the French Empire lost the 7 Years' War, the Osage Nation would also participate in Pontiac's War against the British Empire by taking part in the Battle of Fort des Chartres in 1765 CE. As a result of the Cherokee victory over the British in the Anglo-Cherokee War and the brutal stalemate that Pontiac's War became, the British Empire created the Proclamation of 1763 CE, which would forbid British colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And as the proclamation's date suggests, This was declared in 1763 CE. Now, I do need to point out that this is a little bit of a this is a little bit of a map is a little bit of a misnomer because this boundary would have been a lot more fluid, and you may not have necessarily looked uh, anything like this, even with the fluidity taken into account. Uh, that being said, it still provided some degree of separation or boundary between the British colonies and what the British called Indian Reserve. Which now brings us to the next section, the Osage Nation and the Spanish Empire. So, after the 7 Years' War, Spain would cede Florida to the British Empire after losing to them, as they were one of the several nations that fought and empires that fought alongside the French Empire, ceding Florida to the British Empire in 1763 CE. That being said, to balance Spain's loss of Florida, the British Empire would give the Spanish Empire most of what had been French Louisiana. Just 1 year after the gaining French Louisiana from the British, the Spanish would send French Creole fur trader Rene Auguste Chateau Jr. To found St. Louis, which he found in 1764 CE. However, despite gaining most of Louisiana due to internal uprisings such as the Louisiana Rebellion, which lasted between 1768 and 1769 CE, the Spanish is unable to officially seize control of St. Louis until May 1770 CE. Once they officially officially seized control of St. Louis, the Osage Nation and the Spanish Empire would enter a period of uneasy peace and trade relations from 1770 to 1789 CE, as evidenced as shown in this graph here, showing the number of gifts and trade goods that the Spanish Empire gave the Osage Nation, among other Native American nations, such as the various um, Sioux peoples, such as the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. However, the peace between the Spanish Empire and the Osage Nation, would deteriorate after the Spanish Empire captured several Osage leaders. This would then lead the Spanish Empire to periodically plan invasions of the Osage Nation. However, these plans either never came to fruition, or those that did come to fruition were met with swift defeat by the powerful Osage Nation, whose warriors outnumbered the Spanish, on top of the fact that the Osage warriors were more experienced and more skilled in warfare than the Spanish forces in Louisiana. And these are pictures of sort of the types of Spanish soldiers that would have existed in the Spanish colonies in North America. There's some degree of variation, as these would have been more indicative of Spanish soldiers in the American Southwest, whereas these would have been what Spanish soldiers in the Great Plains and in Louisiana would have looked like. It would also be during this time that, or possibly during this time, that would be the first, at least indirect, um, or at least more indirect than it would eventually become, contact between the Osage Nation and the United States. And this is because one Osage leader by the name of Pahushka is reported to have participated in the Battle of the Wabash, also known as St. Clair's defeat against the United States in the Northwestern War in 1791 CE. But this is not necessarily completely confirmed, um, which is why which is why I count it as at least indirect contact, because one or a few Osage warriors participating in this battle, uh, they were just warriors, several warriors among a whole host of Native American warriors from several very large Native American nations. Eventually, the conflict between the Osage Nation and the Spanish Empire would come to an end when the Spanish Empire founded Fort Carondelet on the Osage River, which I do want to pause and say I apologize. I'm well aware I've butchered all the French pronunciations. I do apologize. Um, Please bear with me. After this fort is founded by the Spanish Empire, the Osage would actually be pleased, as this meant that they had a fur trading post nearby, which would give them easier access to manufactured goods and would allow them to increase their prestige among other Native American nations, with this fort being founded in 1795 CE. Then, in 1800 CE, Spain would cede the Louisiana Territory back to France as part of Napoleon's secret Third Treaty of San Ildefonso. And then between 1801 and 1802 CE, tragedy would strike the Osage Nation and the Quapaw Nation, as one of the many epidemics that would frequently happen during this time period uh, would break out, specifically a smallpox epidemic that would result in the death of an estimated 2,000 Osage. Now, this brings us to the first direct contacts between the Osage Nation and the United States. So, this started first with Napoleon Bonaparte's selling of Louisiana to the United States in the very famous Louisiana Purchase to pay for his war effort in Haiti in 1803 CE. After this, the United States would send the Lewis and Clark expedition um, to explore the Louisiana Territory, which would result in the first official meeting between the United States and the Osage Nation, with the expedition itself lasting between 1804 and 1806 CE. After this, several prominent Osage would travel to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Thomas Jefferson on July of 1804 CE. And then after this meeting with the Osage, Thomas Jefferson would actually write about the power of the Osage Nation in a letter to Robert Smith that he sent on July 13th of 1804 CE. And I will read an excerpt of this letter right here. The excerpt states, "The Osage arrived the day before yesterday, had their first audience yesterday, and will have another today. They are the finest men we have ever seen. They have not yet learnt the use of spirituous liquors. We shall endeavor to impress them strongly, not only with our justice and liberality, but with our power, and therefore shall send them on to see our populous cities, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. The truth is they are the great nation of the south of the Missouri. Their possessions extending from thence to the Red River, as the Sioux are the great of the north of that river. With these two powerful nations, we must stand well, because in their quarter we are miserably weak. I see nothing to these two powerful nations. Yeah, sorry, I see nothing to prevent my departure on the 23rd, except affectionate salutations and prayers for the health of your young family. Thomas Jefferson. So as you can see, Thomas Jefferson, and probably a great many United States politicians were very well aware of the power, military power, and the political influence and power that the Osage Nation held. And just one day after sending this letter, the United States government would appoint the wealthy French fur trader Jean Pierre Chouteau as the Indian agent assigned to the Osage, with the appointment being on July 14th, 1804 CE. Then, just 2 years later, in 1806 CE, Jefferson would appoint Meriwether Lewis as Indian agent for the territory of Missouri and the region. After his appointment, Meriwether Lewis would anticipate that the United States would have to go to war with the Osage Nation because of the start of Osage raids on Eastern Native American nations and white American settlements. However, as the United States lacked sufficient military strength to coerce the Osage Nation into ceasing its raids, remember during this period of time, as I've mentioned in multiple videos, including the video on the Northwestern War, the United States at this point in time only had between 1,000 to 3,000 soldiers. Because of this, Lewis and the United States decided to supply other Native American nations, such as the Potawatomi, the Sauk, and the Meskwaki Fox nations, with weapons and ammunition, under the understanding that they would attack the Osage to the point that they, quote, cut them off completely or would drive them from their country. And Meriwether Lewis in the United States would do this in 1807 CE. Then the United States and the Osage Nation, led by several prominent Osage, such as Les Soldats du Chien, would sign their first treaty, known as the Treaty of Fort Osage, where the Osage would make a major cession of land in present-day Missouri, ceding 52 million acres of land to the United States government. This treaty would create a buffer line between the Osage Nation and new white American settlements in the Missouri Territory. It would also establish the requirement that the United States president had to approve all future land sales and cessions by the Osage Nation. And here is a map showing the cessions in the 1808 Osage Treaty here. The treaty would also state that the United States would protect the Osage Nation from insults and injuries of other tribes of Indians situated near the settlements of white people. However, as was common in Native American relationships with the federal government, the Osage Nation would find that the United States did not carry through on this commitment. Then Manuel Lisa, John Pierre Chouteau, and William Clark would go on to found the Missouri Fur Company in 1809 CE. And here's a map of the sort of extent of the Missouri Fur Company's fur trading activities, which you can see here in the double dotted lines, with their main focus being beaver pelts. Then in 1812 CE, the United States would go to war against the British Empire in what would become known as the War of 1812. The Osage Nation during this conflict would occasionally join the United States in attacks on British allied Native American nations such as the Sauk and Meskwaki Fox nations. Eventually, the War of 1812 CE would come to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in February 15th, 1815 CE. Now, this is the official ending, but those of you who know history and have seen my video on the War of 1812, actually, there were several conflicts, such as the Battle of New Orleans and the British seizures of Mobile and South Georgia, that happened after this treaty was signed. Now, this brings us to our next section, a section that I briefly touched upon in my video on the Cherokee Nation, but now that we're going to go into more detail on the Osage-Cherokee War. So, this started between 1816 and 1817 CE when several prominent Cherokee leaders, such as the Bull and Sequoia, would lead several groups of Cherokee west of the Mississippi River to settle in what would become known as the Western Cherokee or the Arkansas Cherokee Nation. As this Cherokee migration to the Arkansas Territory, to the Osage Territory, was happening, United States Major William Lovely would attempt to create a large strip of land to act as a buffer between the Osage and Cherokee nations by purchasing 3 million acres of land from the Osage Nation in what would become known as Lovely's Purchase. And upon signing this treaty, the Osage and the Cherokee would pledge to honor said treaty. However, the treaty would hide clauses such as the forbidding of Osage hunting east of the treaty boundary and complicated wording. And the United States government had not authorized nor endorsed the treaty and therefore did not officially recognize its terms. With these negotiations being held and the signing of the treaty being held in 1816 CE. Upon arriving into Osage territory, the Western Cherokee Nation would quickly come into conflict with the Osage Nation because the Cherokee were encroaching on and settling and stealing Osage lands, which would lead the Osage Nation to launch raids to drive the Cherokee from Arkansas. Again, starting in 1816 CE. In retaliation for this, 500 Cherokee, along with a number of Choctaw, Chickasaw, and white Americans, would attack an Osage village at Claremore Mound, where they would kill 38 Osage, including Osage leader Claremont, seen here, and would take 104 captives. However, most of the Osage warriors were away on a hunt when their village was attacked. Though it is also important to note the Osage did not immediately retaliate, with this attack having happened on January of 1817 CE. After attacking Claremore Mound, the Western Cherokee and their allies would then march to the village of Osage leader Black Dog, as most of that village's warriors were also away on a hunt. However, Black Dog was able to evacuate the women and children along with the remaining warriors of the village to a cave that he had previously fortified and stocked with enough food to survive for a year before the Western Cherokee and their allies could arrive. The Osage who were taken captive after these attacks would then be given to the Eastern Cherokee as payment for contributions in the battle. Then in 1817 CE, the United States would construct Fort Smith in Arkansas between the Cherokee and Osage settlements. The United States would then legalize and enforce the Lovely Purchase by coercing the Osage Nation to cede the land outlined in the 1816 CE treaty. However, the United States, probably not surprising anyone watching, would keep the land for itself rather than selling it to the Cherokee Nation, doing this in 1818 CE. And here is a map of the land ceded right here by the Osage to the United States in the 1818 enforcement of Lovely's Purchase. Instead of submitting, the defeat at Claremore Mound would actually stir the Osage into greater fury, with hostilities between the Osage and the Cherokee resuming when a group of Cherokee followed the Osage further up the river, up the Missouri River. However, the Osage knew that they were coming and were ready and had gathered warriors and allies. The Osage then proceeded to decimate the Cherokee. In response for the Cherokee attacks, the Osage would then launch 2 decades of sporadic retaliatory raids on the Western Cherokee. With this conflict, really, you could argue, as I've showed in the previous video, you could argue started in 1817 CE, but the height of these raids was between 1820 and 1839 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, Osage society during the 1800s. Starting with Osage culture. So, Osage society was a patrilineal society, much like modern white American culture, meaning that the kinship is traced from the father's line through the male line. A person identifies with their father's lineage, and property is passed down through the father's family. Again, much like modern white American culture, where, for example, my last name is my father's last name, and I trace my lineage through my father's line, etc. That being said, Osage society was a matrilocal society, meaning that when a young couple married, that they lived with the woman's family, which is very different from most patrilineal societies where they are patrilocal, meaning they live when a young couple marries, they live with the father's family. The Osage people had an exogamous clan system, meaning individuals would be expected to marry outside of their clans, their clan or clans, or other groups, in addition to outside closer blood relatives, meaning they can't marry close blood relatives. Women were in charge of agriculture, planting and harvesting the crops, as well as owning the agricultural fields. Men, meanwhile, would be chiefs and in charge of hunting and war. Marriages could actually involve multiple wives, though even then, women still had a great deal of influence in picking their spouses. And here's the source I got this from. Now we look at Osage warfare. Warfare was an important way for men to gain social prestige. Osage warriors would receive honors by performing heroic deeds in warfare, with the highest honor being performed while defending the villages and fields where women worked. Other heroic deeds included wounding or striking an enemy and the beheading of enemies. However, the latter deed is among the least honored of the heroic deeds that one could perform. Like the other Native American peoples and nations of the Great Plains, after the adoption and domestication of horses in the 1600s CE, the Osage became skilled, horse-born warriors. Warfare consisted mainly of raids and ambushes and was often focused on either obtaining captives or capturing horses. Osage warriors were particularly known for practicing what is called bluff wars, which consisted of baiting enemies to fight, commonly using insults to accomplish this. And as I alluded to just a couple of minutes ago, often Osage warriors would practice the beheading of enemy intruders. Osage warriors were also well known for their skill in combat and their reported, of course, again, this is coming from European sources, but still reported lack of concern for their own well being in combat. For example, one of these European sources, a Spanish account, while heavily biased, because most European sources were, described an event where an entire Spanish garrison was required to subdue a single Osage warrior. Whether or not this account is true is irrelevant because the account speaks and attests to the respect and fear that the Europeans and the United States had for the combat abilities of the Osage Nation. While the Osage Nation never completely developed separate warrior societies in the same way as other Native American nations of the Great Plains, in 1840 CE, a French trader would note that a group of young warriors had formed a separate village and was calling themselves the Band of Dogs. This is possibly the beginning of a warrior society akin to the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers or the Crow Fox Society. Warfare in Osage culture and much of the Great Plains nations could be prevented by providing compensation to a family, village, or nation for the death of a member of the community in warfare or as a result of murder. Estimates of how many warriors the Osage Nation could field range as low as 1,000 to as many as 2,000, with a warrior to general population ratio of 6 to 1 at the lowest and 3 to 1 at the highest. Again, this is very important to note because during the earliest contacts between the Osage and European nations, such as the Spanish Empire and the United States, oftentimes the Osage warriors, one, outnumbered the soldiers, and two, for example, the United States, up until the War of 1812 CE, only had an army that consisted of between 1,000 to 3,000 soldiers. So the Osage Nation, up until the 1810s, arguably the 1820s, was very much as militarily powerful as the United States and other European colonies in North America. And here is the sources that I used here. And now we're going to take a look at Osage warriors and weapons and what they look like in the 1800s CE. So generally, and admittedly, these are slightly biased pictures because these are American pictures of Osage warriors, but these are the best pictures I could find of Osage warriors. Generally, Osage warriors looked something like this. You'll note there's a picture of the Osage leader Black Dog here. And that's because he himself was a warrior, a very well-known warrior. And here are some Osage warriors here as well. And here is Claremore, who um, was a warrior as well, and is obviously being the domesticated horses, Osage warriors were oftentimes horsebound warriors, and they looked something like this. And the weapons that the Osage used were, well, for one thing, the tomahawk. The tomahawk is the most well known Native American weapon, and the Osage certainly used it. But it is important to note that the tomahawk is just a subclass of the weapon class known as the war club. Um, there were other types of war clubs that were used, um, such as the gunstock war club, uh, seen here and here, uh, called as such because they looked vaguely like the stock of a gun, and they could have either an iron spike or blade protruding outside of them. They could also just be a solid piece of wood that would be swung sort of like a bat. We all have a general idea of how much it hurts to be hit by a solid wooden bat. Other examples might have just a like straight up knife blade broken off of a knife attached to it, as you can see here in this picture. And then the Osage also used mace like war clubs like this one here. And then the Osage also used various types of knives, like this example here. Uh, and while they were horsebound, they used lances, which was common to most Native American nations on the Great Plains, because obviously when you're riding a horse, a lance or a spear is very effective. And then they also wielded various buffalo hide shields where pieces of wood were attached to, where pieces of buffalo hide were covering pieces of wood. And then they would also wear um, bone armor, like you see here, bone breastplates. Uh, and for long range weapons, they first, of course, used bows. They were very skilled with the Osage bow made out of Osage orange wood. But also, after contact with Europeans, the Osage would also begin using firearms like this musket you see here. Now we come to the government of the Osage Nation. So the Osage Nation was divided into two territorial divisions, the Sky Division and the Earth Division. With the Osage Nation having 21 clans divided between the divisions, the Sky Division having 9 clans within its boundaries, and the Earth Division having 14 clans within its boundaries. The Osage Nation also contained a minimum, meaning there's more, it could be more than this at any given time, a minimum of 55 sub clans. Then the Osage political offices consisted of the leaders of each division who were in charge of mediation between villages, diplomacy with outsiders, and leading religious ceremonies, leading wars, and leading bison hunts. Then you had the advisors. There were 5 advisors of each Osage leader. These included the great soldier, the chief soldier, and the little soldier. Then you had the council, which was a group of older and wiser members of the village, of a village, who would make decisions for each village as well as the nation based on consensus. They are responsible for maintaining the relationship between villages and nations, along with regulating warfare. The council was actually traditionally more powerful politically than the Osage leaders. Then there's the war leader, who is the official leader of a war party, but in reality had the primary role of fasting and praying for the success of a raid. After that, there was the chief war captain, who was the true leader of a war party, and then there were other war captains under the chief war captain who would advise the chief war captain and were responsible for establishing the strategy of the expedition and directing attacks. Then you had the ceremonial leader, individuals in charge of leading specific rituals. However, they could not initiate rituals as their power was limited to a specific ceremony. And then you had the speaker, which was a skilled speaker who had a prominent role in Osage ceremonies, but did not possess any significant political status. And here are the sources I used for this information. Now we're going to look at Osage villages. So generally, during the 1800s, Osage villages looked something like this. They lived in birch bark and log longhouses, and lived in permanent villages. And again, here's another example of that. Again, seeing the logs making the frame of an Osage longhouse that would be then covered in birch bark. And here are some more examples here. And they would also live in circular houses of similar structure, i.e., being made from logs and birch bark, that you can see here with this lodge here. Now this brings us to the economy of the Osage Nation. Traditional Osage agriculture was based on crops such as corn, beans, and squash, and the Osage would hunt and harvest various animals such as deer, bison, bear, elk, and various types of fish. The Osage were also major middlemen in the Great Plains trading networks, which you can see here on these maps here, with the red squares seen here, or the diamonds seen here, representing the primary trading centers, and then you had the secondary trading centers, and then you had the permanent secondary trading centers that consisted of the Osage, as you can see on these maps here. And these were rather extensive trade networks, which you can also see on these maps. With trade goods coming through this network, including things like ceremonial pipes, the stone that these pipes were made of, the aptly named pipestone, as well as obsidian from Yellowstone and other volcanic areas, precious stones such as turquoise, and copper from the Great Lakes, as well as horses. Horses were traded and were a valuable commodity, commodity for most Great Plains Native American nations. The Osage were also major, as I mentioned earlier, major participants in the deerskin trade, selling 12,000 deerskins in 1734 CE, 100,000 deerskins in 1744 CE, 8,000 deerskins in 1757 CE, 20,000 pounds of pelts, including deerskins, amounting to 46% of the industry in Illinois alone in 1775 CE, 24,000 pesos worth of pelts, including deerskins, in 1798 CE, $20,000 worth of pelts, including deerskins, in 1806 CE, 30,000 pounds of deer skins in 1809 CE, 40,000 pounds of deer skins in 1823 CE, and 50,000 pounds of deer skins in 1825 CE. Now, obviously, that's not every single year that the Osage brought deer pelts in for sale. This, but even with that in mind, that actually makes us even more of a staggering amount of deer skins because this is just a few of the years they sold. One can only imagine just how many deer pelts they sold when taking into account every year they brought deer pelts, deer skins in to the market to be sold. And here are the sources I used for this information. In return for the deerskins, the Osage Nation would gain white European and American metal tools that were greatly sought after. In fact, most of the trade goods sought after by the Osage Nation were utilitarian tools made of steel or iron, including farming hoes, metal knives, razors, sewing needles, owls, and then, of course, firearms and muskets. Between 1821 and 1837 CE, Jesuit missionaries would enter the Osage Nation in an attempt to convert the Osage, but would be met with heavy opposition by most of the Osage Nation. In fact, the Osage Nation was one of several nations that heavily fought conversion for as long as possible. Now we come to our next section, the Osage Nation and Indian removal. Starting with further cessions of land to the United States. So, due to increasing intrusions of white Americans and Eastern Native American nations, as well as the increasing popularity of removing the Native American nations of the East to Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory west of the Mississippi, the United States would coerce the Osage Nation into ceding 45 million acres of their land to the United States. The Osage only agree as they are now too weak militarily to stand up to the United States, who now outnumber them both in general population and in military. And this happened in 1825 CE, with the Osage being sequestered to this thin strip of land here. The Osage Nation and the United States would meet again at Council Grove, where the United States would pay the Osage Nation to allow the Santa Fe Trail to be ran through their territory, and the United States would also pay to prevent future Osage raids on white American settlers. With this happening also in 1825 CE. And here is a map of the Santa Fe Trail here. And a map of the Santa Fe Trail seen here as well. Then, of course, came Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act, with Andrew Jackson being elected as President of the United States in 1828 CE, which would eventually lead to the removal of Eastern Native American nations west of the Mississippi to Indian Territory, with the United States forcibly removing the 5 southeastern Native American nations and many of the Native American nations of the Northeast to the west of the Mississippi River to former Osage land in Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory. This results in the deaths of a minimum, meaning there was probably more, a minimum of 15,000 Native Americans between 1829 and 1850 CE. And as you can see here on this map here, this happened all over the place. Right here, including the 5 tribes that I mentioned, but also including other tribes such as the Miami and the Ottawa and the Winnebago, all of whom that I have already either mentioned or will mention in a later video in this series, or I will cover in a later video in this series. And here's that map again. Then even more tragedy would strike the Osage and all Native American nations in the region when yet again another series of these several very frequent epidemics that would happen during this period of time break out, specifically influenza, cholera, and smallpox epidemics, which would result in the deaths of nearly 5,000 Osage between 1829 and 1838 CE. While the forcible removal of the Native American nations east of the Mississippi was happening, as well as while the epidemics of influenza, cholera, and smallpox were happening, rising tensions between the Kiowa Nation and the Osage Nation eventually lead Osage leader Black Dog to launch an attack on a Kiowa village. Black Dog's warriors cut off the heads of their victims and arrange them in rows of brass cooking buckets and take the Kiowa's sacred medicine bundle. And this event is actually recorded on a Kiowa winter count calendar, a common calendar used by the Native American peoples of the Great Plains to keep records. In response to the Osage attack and the theft of their sacred medicine bundle, the Kiowa and their Comanche allies launched retaliatory raids against the Osage. Again, this picture depicts a Comanche warrior on the right chasing an Osage warrior on the left, as we saw already earlier in the video. The Kiowa would demand the return of their sacred medicine bundle, which Black Dog would eventually return. Now this brings us to our next section, the aftermath of the Osage land cessions and Indian removal. So for one thing, as I already mentioned a little bit earlier in the video, the Osage Nation is greatly diminished and restricted to Kansas Indian Territory, with the, so you find it here, the Osage being restricted to this area here, labeled by the number 17. Then, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act would result in numerous white Americans settling in Kansas Territory. Then, and when the American Civil War broke out between 1861 and 1865 CE, the Osage Nation would remain largely neutral during the conflict. However, it would be for naught, as on September 10th, 1870 CE, as white American settlers continued to encroach on their lands, the Osage Nation would sign the Treaty of Drum Creek with the United States and cede the last of their land in Kansas in return for land in Oklahoma Indian Territory. At the same time this was happening, as well as after, many Osage would serve as scouts for the United States Army in the wars between the United States and the other Native American nations of the Great Plains. Now this brings us to our last section, the Osage people today. Well, the Osage people persist in Oklahoma, as you can see here in this seal and in this map, and they continue to hold on strong to their culture and continue to preserve their culture despite repeated and continued, like despite previous and repeated attempts to destroy, continued attempts to destroy Osage culture. Now that brings us to the end of our video. As with the previous videos, I hope that you enjoyed the parts of the video that were about the Osage culture and the rise of the Osage Nation, but I really, really hope that you did not enjoy the parts of the video that were involved the tragedies, the epidemics, and the forcible removal of the Osage Nation from their homelands, as well as the attempts to destroy Osage culture. And I know, as I've said in the previous videos, I know that's a little bit strange to hear the person making the video say this, but the reason I bring up these subjects is not necessarily for entertainment, it is for education, because far too often these subjects are not talked about in American and really European education. So it's important to learn about them, so that we can make sure that nothing like this ever happens to the Osage or any Native American nation ever again. So with that, that will be the end of the video. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want me to cover any of the subjects I mentioned in the video and later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And I hope you all have a good day.